and thank you. Lena, welcome to our session. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, no, Donna, thank you for the introduction. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here. I'm just thrilled to be able to come talk a little bit about Tier 3 instruction and matching that instruction to student need, which is the emphasis today of the session. I want to share that this work that I'm sharing has emerged from a variety of sources. One, it includes my work at Patton. I, as Donna said, have been working with Patton for a number of years now in initiatives related to multi-tier systems of support. And we started to build some content around Tier 3 instruction within the context of those series. So certainly that has anchor and grounds some of the work that I'll share. In addition to that, in my work as an academic, my team and I are doing additional research on what it means to implement a Tier 3 intervention and what components are optimally included in that type of intervention for students who struggle with early reading. And so from my own world, in terms of research, I am definitely using that work to inform this presentation as well. So things have a nice synergy and have come together to emphasize the focus of this presentation today, which will be about instructional matching at Tier 3. And we're going to anchor that on what we know from the research to the extent that we know it, using evidence-based practices. In terms of materials, I would love you to have access to two primary sources. The first is the copy of the PowerPoint I'll be sharing today, so you're welcome to have that, and you can follow along with the presentation. The second is a resource packet. That document is a Word document, and that will allow us to look at some of the content with more depth. I will toggle over to the resource packet on occasion during the presentation so we can take a look at the materials there and how you might use those for implementation. So that is good to have as well. So two primary sources of information. As we move forward with our session today, I will also introduce a third source that I want you to know about. But for now, let's just stick with the two that I have on the screen. For the most part, I want you to dialogue and chat with me. I want you to optimize that chat box. So please, when you have questions, submit them via chat. My Patton colleagues are going to monitor the chat box, and on certain pause points, natural breaks in the content, I'll stop, check in with them, and see if there have been any questions that I can help address. So definitely, ask your questions in the chat if something is of interest or you have that inquiry. The other way to use the chat is please dialogue. If something resonates with you or really connects to you, if what we're talking about reminds you of a student you're working with, please share. I think having that is parallel to the content I'm presenting provides a nice context. So you're welcome just to freely share observations and reflections as they occur to you. I will also, my third reason for the chat is to actually prompt you to use it. So I will prompt you to respond in the chat. And I think it's a good way for us to collectively see how we're all thinking about this material. It also is a great way for me to check too on how you are responding and thinking about things. So please be ready to really optimize that chat box during this session. Sometimes I will have you use annotate, the annotate function, specifically the text box on the screen, but I was looking at the content and I really think we can just optimize that chat box thoroughly today and not worry about the annotate feature. So for our agenda, we are spending the afternoon together, which I appreciate. So we are meeting and talking about Tier 3 instructional matching from now until 4 o'clock this afternoon. So what I'd like to do is cover the content in this way, building some knowledge initially, and then steering down to practice in that instructional matching of interventions. So here are the questions I'll be responding to and have my content organized to address. The first is I want to look at that Tier 3 problem-solving process, and I want to see how it's used to intensify instruction for students who are at risk for reading and writing disabilities. So we begin looking at what that process is, and that will be our anchor. The second thing we'll spend some time doing in the first part of our session is discussing why language is so important for the prevention and treatment and intervention with students who have specific reading and writing disabilities. So why is understanding language so important? And then connected to that, how can that understanding help us start to conceptualize instructional profiles for students who might require Tier 3 intervention, and how we might be able to drive that, use that as a framework to match our instruction to educational need of students. So as we move through our session, we'll move from the knowledge of what Tier 3 problem solving process is. We'll also think about what language is and how it's important for our framework. We'll introduce the framework and then get to the matching. So that's how we'll conclude. I really think of our time divided in half. We'll spend the first part more on that knowledge building, looking at problem solving, looking at the language piece, and then the second part are really focusing on instructional and on the instruction. How do you match instruction? What does that instruction look like? So that's where we'll get to after a break. I'm looking for a session break around 2:15-ish approximately. So I will be monitoring my presentation, and we'll stop at a natural break, plus or minus a few minutes around 2:15. We'll take a full 15-minute break and come back and get into more of the practice piece in the second part. So let's get going. So one of the things we need to do is anchor this process, thinking about Tier 3 intervention to problem solving. So looking at the multi-tiered system of support model, today we're talking about students who require the most intensive intervention, right? So the intervention required to the fewest number of students. Just as a review, our multi-tiered systems of support, we're trying to structure a system to address the needs of all of our students as readers, in the case we're talking about today. So having a core, a foundation of support that addresses the needs of most to all of the students we have in our school population. So that's your core, your foundation. And a multi-tiered system of support, then you have more intensive layers of support in that system. So at Tier 2, we provide intervention for some students to more fully access that core, participate in that core. Often at a Tier 2 intervention level, we might pre-teach or review content, reinforce that content of the core. And we see Tier 2 typically as highly aligned with the core, right? Because we really want those students to be able to access that core and participate as productively as possible. At the Tier 3 level, or the most intensive level of support, now we're thinking about instructional intensification. We're thinking about skill groups, intervening in area of need, and related to language-based processing, which is our lens today. So we're really up and talking about Tier 3. The important thing I want to note, though we are talking about Tier 3 today, it can't be divorced from or separated from your entire system. It's built on the foundation of your core and the additional intervention support you might be providing in Tier 2. So what I'm saying is, what I'm going to present will sound intensive. It's going to sound like it's a lot to provide to students related to instruction and intervention, and that's true. And it's true because we're talking about the students with the most significant needs. That's your Tier 3. Optimally, we're trying to balance out the system so this level of support is provided to the fewest students, a handful of students that require this Tier 3 intervention. When I think about Tier 3, these are the questions that I ask very practically from a systems perspective. I want to know how students are processing language. That's one of the questions I think about when I think about the students who require Tier 3 instructional support. I want to know what their instructional profiles are, and we'll figure that out today. Instructional profiles will frame how you match to instruction. I want to then take that process and match, and that's your third question here. How can I use those student instructional profiles to select the intervention and intensify it if, around the areas of need? That's your matching. So those are your three things. How do students process language? What are the instructional profiles for students requiring Tier 3 instruction? And then how can we match, right? How can we match that instruction? So when we're talking about multi-tiered systems of support, when we get to Tier 3, there are a series of problem-solving steps that drive implementation in the process. So Tier 3 problem-solving steps drive that process. And these aren't just like steps to have because they're good. They're steps to have because they actually work, and they will be how you work through Tier 3 as a process. So these are real steps in my work with the National Center on Improving Literacy and at Boston University. These are the real steps that we use to help figure out needs for students at that Tier 3 level. So we begin with the review of our Tier 1 and Tier 2 data. Always, we're looking for students who may not have made the progress we expect. And at that point, we start to generate a hypothesis about why. Using data, why aren't these students? What might be happening? That hypothesis is really important because that then steers the diagnostic assessment that we will do. So we conduct more in-depth assessment at that point in time, a diagnostic measure that really gets at strengths and needs for students. That will help you determine instructional profile. We also then look at, from that diagnostic assessment, we continue to make a hypothesis, right? We're figuring things out. And I want you to feel comfortable in Tier 3 to feel like, yeah, we're figuring this out, and we may not know a definitive approach. We have to use our data, use our data. But at the third step, we generate another hypothesis based on our diagnostic assessment. It's talking about what skills students have mastered or not, and a little bit more about that instruction. Then to the right-hand side of the screen, we look at selecting an intervention at that point. So with intervention selection, that's our matching. So we're using the hard work that we did on the left-hand side of the screen to actually match and start to put a program together for students based on their instructional needs. 6 through 7 is then the ongoing monitoring that we want to do to make sure our intervention, as we're starting to implement it, is working for students, and whether or not we have to make adjustments along the way. For the purpose of this presentation today, I'm going to cover steps 1 through 4 in detail. So I'm looking at steps 1 through 4 of the process, basically really highlighting how you get to matching. Sort of before I leave this introduction behind, one of the things I really want to emphasize is that this whole process of Tier 3 and getting into the specifics of what students require related to instruction and intervention requires teaming. We'll talk today about how complex these kids are. Their needs are pretty significant. And what we need to do is work in partnership to really figure this out. It does require a team with different areas of expertise, and it requires those involved at a systems level with infrastructure to help us work through the types of things we need to grapple with. So for example, education leadership supports through scheduling and coordination of implementation. We need the speech and language professionals who have that specialization to help us sort through the language piece that I'll be talking about today, the language processing. We need our school psychologists to be able to help us with the psychometrics of data and potentially help us implement those diagnostic assessments. So we have a broader need to really embrace this process as not just one person, not the special education teacher or the reading specialist or the English language learner teacher to really go it alone. It's teaming. It really requires the teaming to figure this out and implement. So I just want to kind of put that note out there. Optimally, this is not you, or you're a silo and you're in it alone. It's collective. So let's transition into that language part now. I really want you to understand how important language processing is for the prevention, treatment, and identification of students with reading and writing disabilities. And to do that, we're going to begin with a few case studies, student case studies. And I'm going to stop my share and just come over and talk to you a little bit here about what we're going to do next. So I want to introduce you to 3 different students via video clip. These students are representing how students process language. All of these examples represent just a little bit, just something a little bit different in terms of how students process language. I'm going to introduce all of them to you back to back. So we'll have a sample of one student. We'll kind of check in, and I want to see what you observe about that student, then another, and then a third set of examples. What I'm essentially doing is presenting through student voices how language-based difficulties exist on a continuum. So I want you to think about how language-based difficulties exist on a continuum. We're going to start with Aubrey, and she most represents a student who has expressive language difficulties. We're going to move to another set of examples and listen to those students speak and communicate about their experience with dyslexia. Then I'm going to present a final example about a student with dysgraphia. For each of these, as we move through each set of examples, I want you to be observers. What do you hear in the student's expressive language itself? How are they speaking? Is it coherent? Is it linked? Is language linked together? Are they talking in full utterances, full sentences, or is it more labored? Can you tell if they're trying to pause to find, word search, find those words to speak? So listen to the language itself. The other thing to look for and listen for with the students is their expression of their experience. How do they feel as learners? Aubrey is young. She won't express that per se, but the others will. And I want you to hear what they express. After each video, we're going to come back. I'm going to check in with you. And I want to prompt you in the chat to note your observations. What do you observe about how this student is using language or communicating about their experience? So let's start with Aubrey first. She's the youngest example. We're going to listen to her work with someone. He's trying to help her do a retell of a story. Okay, so you're going to listen to Aubrey as she does that. I like to play my video clips outside the context of my PowerPoint. I just think they play better for you. So let me move over to that, and I will share Aubrey.
Hey.
Hey.
How you doing today?
Good.
What's your name?
Aubrey.
What grade are you in?
3rd.
How old are you?
8.
So, what book did you just read?
Author's Lost Truth.
Was it a good book?
Yes.
You want to tell me about that book?
Yes. Well, most of the things like that, author's first to. He wanted to come out, and then it's Sister Violet. It's scared of the dark. She's scared of the dark, and she came, and then she yanked the doorknob right on the doorknob, and called, and then the babysitter came, and it came out. And then it was a good book. And then marshmallows, s'mores, tapioca. That's it.
Okay. You enjoyed the book?
Yup.
Okay.
Are we done?
So while I am queuing up my next video, please in the chat box, respond with your observations about Aubrey. What did you observe about her? How did she use language? What were your observations about Aubrey's? And I'm going to queue up the next one here. Now I will come over and I will check in with you in the chat. Yeah, thanks everyone. Yes, she's taking a long time to process. Her speech is long and laborious. Some of you are noting she didn't have any organization to her retell, that she's simply, pulling thoughts as they come to her potentially. Some of you are even noticing that she's difficulty finding words, and that the overall retrieval is pretty slow. Not speaking in complete sentences, so single word responses. And thank you for noting the pronoun use. So she's not specific about how she's identifying characters in the story either. So you all are spot on. And these are the observations we have of a student like Aubrey. You keep them coming in. You're all right. And I appreciate the sharing, because if you are reading the chat along with me, we're getting, by just your input here, we're getting a pretty comprehensive observation from lots of educators on Aubrey's language use. Please hold Aubrey in mind as we move forward. I want you to really kind of have her as a picture in your head when we talk about language use where the expressive nature of communication is challenged, particularly around areas that convey meaning. So do hold her there for that. So I'm going to turn to a different student example. So this student I'm going to introduce is Daniel. I was looking for something to represent dyslexia. I want you to hear students themselves, hear them speak, hear them reflect on their experience. And I came across Daniel's video. He does his own thing. I think he has his own YouTube channel. He really has spent time here just pouring his thoughts out. He like a video log, right? A vlog, to express and share what he wants us to know about what it's like to live with dyslexia. So do listen to his speech, different from Aubrey, number one, but also listen to his experience of living with dyslexia. I think he says some very interesting and powerful things that give us a window into what that is like to live with as a reader and writer. So let me cue him up, and same thing. This video is about 3 minutes. I'm going to play it in its entirety, just so you can get a sense of how Daniel is feeling about things related to dyslexia. So different. We're looking at a different example now. Here we go.
So as I've mentioned in previous videos before, I am dyslexic. I have been asked so many stupid questions about dyslexia throughout my lifetime, and I get it's not coming from any kind of malicious place, it's just ignorance. So what I want to do is give some examples of what not to ask a dyslexic person, what it really is, and how it's affected me. I've had someone, when I told them I'm dyslexic, ask me, so when I look at Arabic, that's what it looks like when you look at English. No, that was probably the stupidest example. There's a friend of mine in middle school who said that, and I remember it to this day because I stopped respecting intelligence that day, and it kind of just stuck. No, I don't actually see a foreign language when I look at words, because otherwise I wouldn't read. I had a bunch of people send me the same stupid websites that have the letters physically moving around and changing. That's not dyslexia either. That would be actually hallucinating. It's not a hallucinating disorder. It's a processing disorder. And finally, for the love of God, my eyes eyes are not broken. People have said this to me many, many times. It's not an issue in my actual eyes. It's an issue in my brain. And no, I don't read slower than most people now. I've actually overcompensated to the point where that's no longer a problem because I read nonstop. So many people have asked me again and again to describe what being dyslexic is like to them. And I always respond, describe what being normal is like. You can't, because you have nothing to compare it to. I have nothing to compare dyslexia to because I've never experienced not being dyslexic. The best thing I can do is tell people what it is. And as I mentioned, it's a processing problem. 2 parts of my brain don't talk really good. And so what results, I don't process the words I'm reading always correctly or something. It's hard. I don't even know after having it for 23 years. I can't exactly describe it to you, just like you can't exactly describe how your brain reads normally all the time. Yes, it's been a frustrating thing in my life. It's incredibly frustrating, if not probably the most consistent source of just mild annoyance since I was about 11 when I was diagnosed. And when I was 11 and first diagnosed with it, people would point at a word that had the word the on it, and I'd be like, chicken. Like I couldn't even begin to guess. And I think through about 7 years of therapy, I was able to point to I got my actual reading level. And I was very self-conscious about my reading, and it bothered me. So what I began doing was reading all the time. I read books on 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 books, and never really stopped. And what that has resulted in the long run is this YouTube channel. And so you guys should be grateful for dyslexia because it's giving you this content you're watching, because that self-consciousness resulted in me overcompensating, which resulted in me falling in love with books and wanting to do nothing but read all the time and just be constantly immersed in these different worlds. And sometimes I use audiobooks, sometimes I don't, but it's not a actual physical problem with me. It's a mental thing that does not affect me in any way outside of reading and a little bit of math. But even with math, it's never been that big of a problem with me. I guess a way to think about it is like a computer processing. Computer is getting the data correct, but at some point the data gets skewed a little bit, and it's not always the same flipping or the same thing like that. It's pretty random. Just a quick rant video. No, I'm not looking at Arabic. For the love of God. A few things I've given up on because of dyslexia. I'll never be able to learn a foreign language, which really sucks. I've tried again and again, but they never stick, and it requires so much more effort than for normal people that I can't, and that sucks. But that's pretty much it. A quick little tirade about dyslexia, because I just had another person say something about dyslexia again to me today. Don't ever hesitate to ask a dyslexic person about their dyslexia. They shouldn't get offended or anything, but just think your question through before you ask it, please. That's all. I hope you're all having a good day. This is the least effort video I've ever made, but I just needed to get this tirade out. Have a good one. Like and subscribe, all that crap. Peace.
So there you go. So please, in the chat box, respond with your observations about Daniel, thinking about those 2 things. One related to how he's using language. What do you hear that is so different from Aubrey? And then the second is, what is his message to us? What are you picking up about what he's feeling and expressing related to dyslexia? And just like load that chat up. I'm going to queue up our next video while you do that, and then kind of pop over and see. Great, everyone. Off the bat, you're noticing communication is dramatically different, right? How I know Aubrey's younger, but still, if we equate it, Daniel is far more fluent with his ability to express and articulate his experience with dyslexia. I'm truly amazed on how he describes it to us. Particularly, and I want you to hold on to a bit what he's saying here about processing. Language-based processing. He's got it. He understands that. The language-based processing challenge, and he just nailed that focus. I know. I think he's just very dynamic, candid, focused, articulate, and he really communicates it. I have included, by the way, the links to these videos in the presentation. So if you find use for these in any manner, or if you think having your teachers or your coworkers hear from a student like Daniel and playing the video, I have the link there to share that with you. Yeah, I think it is. This is his normal. I'm watching what Diane is saying there, and he's trying to communicate what that experience is to us. Hold on again to Daniel. Daniel's experience of being a dyslexic reader, particularly how he's communicated the processing piece, right? He says it's not anything wrong with my vision. It's how my brain is processing the what I'm seeing and hearing in terms of language. That's his primary message. One thing I want to do is I think sometimes if I say, well, picture a student with dyslexia in your head, what do they look like? I think we would picture someone like Daniel. I have a hunch that's kind of who we would draw up in our minds and think about, a young man potentially with academic challenges who might be dyslexic. And I want you to really understand that dyslexia doesn't discriminate, right? Little girls and little boys both can have dyslexia. It doesn't discriminate against race or ethnicity. So I want that to be some awareness here. And so just for that purpose, I want to hear Joseph and Gloria. These are older students, college bound, and I want you just to hear a little bit about what they say to their experience. This is just short, and it's merely for the purpose of broadening our scope of who we're talking about, right? Again, dyslexia and any of these language-based disorders we're talking about don't discriminate. So let me just show you those a little bit with Joseph and Gloria. Again, we're still in the realm of dyslexia right now.
Yeah. I still have a lot of trouble reading. I think that now that I know that it's going to take me sometimes twice as long to do the reading, I just plan accordingly. I think that the summer after I found out I had tutoring, so I have done some work to try to help me with that, but it's still a process and it's still a struggle. Like sometimes I get audio books and I just plan according, but I think it's always going to be a long and grinding process. So.
Yeah, I still have a lot of troubles reading, writing, spelling, speaking. I have a lot of troubles, but I love reading. Nobody can tell me anything. I love it. I just take a longer time. But now that I know what to do, and now that I got the help that I needed, and people have helped me to know that, look, this is gonna be difficult. I'm prepared for the battle. And I'm ready to take it.
Yeah, I know I just wanted you to hear these college-bound students from their perspective. So they're speaking to, the process that they've had, the support, say tier 3 type intervention. They're now college bound and able to getting ready to apply the strategies that they've learned and gain through instruction to the college level. So that too just is it was essentially a dyslexia summit, talking and interviewing students with dyslexia. Again, the link is there if you're interested in pursuing that further. We've got two so far. We've got Aubrey, who is, for our purpose, becoming a representation of expressive language difficulties. We have Daniel, along with Joseph and Gloria, who are students who struggle and have overcome, in some sense, dyslexia. And then the third I want you to listen to is Michael. Michael sort of fits a profile of a student who might struggle with something called dysgraphia. And I want you to listen to Michael, again, differentiating Michael from Aubrey and Daniel. What does his speech sound like? What is his oral language? What's that like? And number two, what does he communicate about his experience with reading and writing? He speaks mostly to writing, by the way. So you'll listen to that. So give me a minute here to get that queued up for you, and we will listen to Michael next.
I will write down
but I gotta share it with you to make it work. So let me get that shared, and you can hear Michael. Okay, here we go.
I will write down the sentence or two. It makes sense, but then I write a paragraph, and then it kind of gets confusing. I kind of have the documents on Google Docs if you want to stare at it, but after a while, it's like I just don't convey the thought very well, or I miss articles. I'm always using not a readable, if someone reads it, they will will either quietly just say, oh, okay, this works, because they haven't actually sat down and read it. Like, they just read highlights, and like you could skim through it and somewhat get a better idea than actually sitting down and being like, oh, this is wrong. What do you mean in this? And it gets confusing. It's junior year, I think, for high school, when you're 11th. Yeah, is that when you have Ruggiano as a teacher. Haha, she's gone now, so no worries about her. But she's one of the people that kind of noticed the problem apparently, but was always just saying, just redo it. And that was kind of frustrating on my part. So I'm like, okay, this is my last year of English mandatory thing. I still need to do some English writing credit of some sort. So I thought college writing, and I don't need to do another year of, oh, this is English 101, or oh, what would you call it, mandatory English class. and with that one, it's college writing, and you had to get a certain essay score, which was like 28, and I got like 29, like barely passing. Because I understand the principles, the logistics easily, because selecting the bubble and saying, oh, this is this article goes here, like or whatever the writing. This is what happens when you go out of school for 3 years. You just lose information. Then the worst thing you could usually do is that you would kind of just like, okay, I'll just quickly do the problem, and that like makes the problem way worse. And that's why it's writing disconnect. I start sounding like a 5-year-old when I am 18 years old, and my teacher's like, I don't get why you keep doing this. You talk intelligently in class, you don't really have problems with what we're saying or doing, you follow the lessons very well, but when you turn in an essay and I actually sit down and read it, it doesn't make sense for your personality, your intelligence, and what usually you convey. Like, I could see remnants of, like, if you were 5 years old, you would be like this, trying to do a quick hash job of a college writing class, which I thought, oh, okay, well, thanks, teacher. That helps. She's like, we're going to actually see if this is a problem, but
So I'm going to stop it there. It's a bit of a longer clip, but you definitely have the essence of, I'm sure, what Michael's communicating. So again, what do you observe about his language? A slightly different compared to the others we've looked at, his oral language and speech, but also what is he telling us about his experience? So with language-based difficulties, we are looking at both reading and writing, and the implications for that. And he's representing just something slightly different. So what did you observe? Please, welcome to share a few thoughts. Thanks, everybody. Lori starting us out. Thank you. Yeah, he is. So comparing contrast, doing a compare contrast, similar to Aubrey, he is a bit slower in terms of being able to access his thoughts. He's also speech is a little bit more disconnected. Thoughts are disorganized. You're right. I think, as Wendy has noted, he's definitely dealing with profound issues around written expression. And he talks about how his teacher observes that he's able to communicate at a higher level through oral language, expressive language, but when it comes to written expressions language, it doesn't match what he's demonstrating, at least in conversation. So he's got a variety of things that are presenting as a bit different, and I want you to hold on to him here is number 3. So we've built 3 already, and I'm going to fill in with some information here. So the first is Aubrey, and I want you to think of her sort of as a first example, as expressive language difficulties. As the second example around dyslexia, think of Daniel and his webcast, his YouTube channel, but also Joseph and Gloria as well. And then as the third example here, is Michael, and his speech absolutely is similar in some ways to Aubrey's, in the sense that he's having trouble conveying meaning and it's disorganized, but at the same time, the writing is a really essential piece here. And I know Laura sort of left us with at least the final comment in my stream in the chat, but it's really, I think he's hard to listen to. Also, there's allusion to being out of school for some time and then maybe back in the system. And then it just seems like he didn't have people in his world to help. And so it just leaves me with some heartbreak to hear his story a bit, but we're gonna let him make a difference for us. And I want you to put this into a context where we can really do some instructional matching to hopefully help students like Daniel in the future. So let me move back to my PowerPoint. I'm going to present a little bit. So sit back and listen and view the slides, but I will pause. I want you to process the content in chunks and actually try to apply it. I'm looking at now, I'm looking at language-based processing. And so as I present each component, I want you to have the experience of either working your processing or potentially applying it. So we'll move along. But essentially what our examples have done is they've showed us how central, number one, I'm always asking to look for oral language as well as what the students were communicating. And so the first point we're taking is that oral language is highly correlated with reading outcomes. It is. So we know that, I think, from our work in the field. It dates back, as you can see, this founding research started in the 1980s, but we know that this is reciprocal. The oral expressive language linked to reading and why the two are so important in instruction. But it's more than that. And that's the second bullet here, that oral language, although so intrinsically connected to reading, oral language and reading are not the same. And there's more related to language to unpack and define, which is why we're starting with what language is and what role it plays with students who have difficulties that warrant a tier 3 intervention. So some basics on language. I want you to really think about how language works. So we have a functional system of language where we process language through a sensory approach. That's the left-hand side of your screen. We also have language at different units and sub-word levels or sub-levels. And so I want you to think about the multi-component aspect to language as we look and start to sort out student needs. So let me take each one. So functional language systems are based on sensory input. So for example, right now you're hearing me speak, and so you are processing language by ear, that auditory piece. We also have language where we are having some kind of input by eye. So that's the text on the page, right? Your eye lands on a printed word and then your brain connects to it and reads that word. So that's input by vision by eye. The outputs are language by hand. So the writing piece there, for example, which we learned from Michael, is an issue. So we're starting to now put terminology to these case studies I shared. So language by hand would be an absolute issue for, say, a student like Michael. Output also is your spoken language. So output language by mouth, we just had three different examples along the continuum of language-based difficulties where we were listening to spoken language by students and discerning just through observation the degree of fluency and completeness of their speech and their ability to comprehensively, for meaning, communicate their ideas. Were those ideas clear and understandable, the comprehension aspect? So these are very key here. Part of this is we have a sensory system, which I want you to understand now has some neurological implications, right? If we have these inputs and outputs that are sensory, we're now tapping into an overall neurological picture of how we process text through reading and writing, right? How we interact with our learning. It connects to how we interact with our physical world around us, but also our social world too, right? So the way that we are connecting through language has these profound connections within the classroom, but also beyond. For those of you from the special education side of things, you probably this is right in your wheelhouse. On the special education side, we often talk about multisensory instruction, and this is where that all comes from, right? We're looking at language by ear, by eye, by hand, by mouth, right? So there's more to it. Whoops. So the different levels, I said language is multi-leveled. And part of what we have to think about is, where does the language break down for students? Is it at the subword level? So for example, language by ear and hearing the sounds in a spoken word like mud. Are you able to hear the sub sounds, the phonemes, smallest unit of sounds in mud? Mud. Can you get that aspect of that word at the subword level? Subword level is also your morphological understanding. So for vocabulary, are you looking at roots, prefixes, suffixes, affixes, that collection of how we analyze words? If I'm looking at morphology, I'm dealing with a subword level. But I'm dealing with vocabulary and meaning, unlike the example on your screen, which deals with sound. Certainly word level. So we have a word level understanding of what words are and how they work. We have put words into context. So we might have multi-word, clausal, or syntax grouping of words. So now we're trying to convey meaning at different levels beyond a word level. So Goopy describes the mud. Or I might have a sentence that conveys a whole story here or idea. The pig loved the goopy mud outside the barn. So that's, now we're connecting language. And then finally, multi-syntax or discourse. So telling a story, having a conversation about mud. So for example, think about Aubrey and her story. It was very disconnected and disorganized, right? Her communication of that retell. Then think about Daniel, more cohesive, right? More cohesive beginning, middle, and end to his story experience of dyslexia. So there we're looking at language at a multi-syntactical or discourse level. So those functions and multi-level components are really important. So we have to think about function of language as well as where the breakdown is happening for students. Is it subword level or larger units? So finally, so language is beyond oral language. That's what I want you to think about when you think about tier 3. And we need to think about how students are processing this language. So how are we processing the speech sounds? So your phonological processing. I think we're most familiar with that, is my hunch. Orthographic processing is, how do we process print? How do we process orthography, which is the print that we see when we're reading? Or it produced when we're writing. Semantic meaning processing, that is in general, how are we conveying meaning? And that semantic processing connects syntactically, it connects to the discourse. So once we go from semantic, syntactic, sentence level, discourse, connected text, all of those bullets, essentially you're talking about meaning processing, but at different levels of meaning. And so what that leaves us is the 3 that I want to talk to you about in more depth. I want you to understand phonological processing, orthographic processing, and then semantic meaning processing, but allowing us, when we look at number 3, to think about different levels of meaning within that context. So let's go through each one of the 3 very briefly, and then I'll pause after each one, and I want you to do a little reflection and application. So we're on the same page about the processing and how it works. So I shared that phonological processing is something we're probably, I'm guessing, familiar with. Phonemes and phonics and phonological awareness have been part of our educational terminology for a while now. Phonological processing is essentially one of the big ideas of reading, right? Phonemes, phonological awareness. But what I want to do is move from that understanding to understanding of how we actually process it in the brain. So when we think about phonological processing, we're looking at the formation, retention and use of speech while performing some kind of cognitive task or linguistic task. And so phonological processing is applied, look at this, to speaking, to listening, to remembering, because we have to code some of our learning auditorially, like you're doing now, to naming things, to thinking, to reading and writing. And so this little thing that we are aware of as phonological awareness. If we think about it from a processing perspective, it connects to everything. It connects to learning broadly. So we have to take seriously the idea that if a student struggles with phonological processing, this will have implications into all aspects of academic learning. So we define phonological processing. We're thinking of a broad class of skills, right? Phonological awareness connects to the spoken language of English in our case, and it involves really understanding and getting at that internal structure of words. So when I say a broad class of skills, whoops, sorry about that, we're looking at the whole continuum. Remember, language has multi-levels, right? And the phonological continuum illustrates that perfectly. We have words, large unit of sounds. We can break those words into syllables, slightly smaller units of sound. An onset rhyme, slightly smaller. We're peeling out the beginning sound of a word as the onset, and the vowel and everything after is the rhyme. So for sunshine, it's unshine as the example there. And phonemes is the phoneme, right? The discrete smallest unit of sound. So with phonemic awareness, we've understood from our research and evidence-based practices that it's really important to get kids to work at the phoneme level with spoken and written words, and at that phoneme level to really develop what's called implicit control of being able to manipulate and substitute, delete, combine phonemes within a word, right? So if I have mad, I can change the middle a to mud, right? So I can really manipulate, substitute, delete sounds to build words. And we want kids not just to do it, but to really understand what they're doing. And that's really a key piece here. So I have these slides that say, think about your students, and they're integrated for all of the 3 areas of language processing that we're talking about today. And I want you to like star these or come back to them. This is slide 24. I think what I would do is bundle them if I could, like into a checklist, right? So one of the early stages of the Tier 3 problem solving process is to look at student data and consider whether or not students are making the expected progress you would like. If they are not, I start to think about some of these things, and these are anecdotal, right? These are observation. They just help guide next steps related to assessment and additional exploration. But to put this in observational terms, things you might see with your students, I would look to see if students are mispronouncing words, if they have trouble remembering sounds, if they have trouble sequencing sounds and spellings, if they're confusing similar sounding sounds, problems pronouncing and spelling nonsense words, trouble remembering information presented orally, and then finally, difficulty remembering names. That's interesting because the way that we learn each other's names is to record that name auditorily in our brain. So if we're having trouble accessing names, it's due to that potentially a phonological processor connection. So thinking about your students is a way just to pull this out to real life kind of things you might see in your classroom and just help you make note of some of those things. So I want you to work your phonological processor. We're going to use this as a pause and processing break for the first of 3 first of 3 language processing areas we're talking about. So give your phonological processor a run for its money today. The first activity is a phoneme counting exercise. So I have some words printed there. Please sort of say them to yourself out loud and determine how many phonemes are in each word. There's a syllable counting activity below that. Read those words to yourself and determine how many syllables are in each word. Just take a pause break. This is also an opportunity if you have questions so far, please let me know, but give this a go and then I'll post some answers on the screen in just a moment. So give you kind of some time to think about phonological processing and test out your processor. All right, in just a minute, I will post the answers. I know I haven't given you complete time to do all of them, but hopefully you've taken a turn to do a few of these. There they go. I think for the most part, when I've talked to groups before, it's ox, that's the trip up for the first phoneme counting. It is difficult. So ox has 3 phonemes because you have ah, and then x as so x is x, so there's the x, so that makes it the 3. So there's an example of yeah, just how complicated and challenging listening and processing phonemes can be. So I'm going to just take a quick pause, stop my screen sharing here, and just check in to see if you all have any questions. Great, everybody.
I know I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, fabulous. We're going to keep building this because I want to get to a complete model of instructional profiles, which requires the 3 levels of processing here. So let me move on to the next example, which is orthographic processing. So with orthographic processing, we are right here. So with orthographic processing, we're taking a shift. What I want you to connect this to is for those of you who have the understanding of the alphabetic principle, we're kind of circling here. Alphabetic understanding is where orthographic processing comes in. But with the processing piece, what we're looking at is how students form, store, and access orthographic representations. Orthographic representations are what we see in print, and how our language always dictates the orthographic foundations and how how our language is written in print. So we are dictated by English in our case. So what we're looking at are individual letters, how students form, store, and access individual letters. We're looking at that applied to letter patterns. So common patterns, ed, ing, even 2 letters that make a single sound, for example, would be a letter pattern, a common letter pattern. Sight vocabulary. It also extends to how we form letters in print ourselves. So it's the reading by eye and writing by hand. All of this connects to learning, knowledge, and memory. So in my little video here, essentially is our brain taking the letters that we see in print and making sense there of the patterns. So we form a whole that we can then check in terms of meaning. So we're connecting this to the alphabetic principle. As I said, English dictates this in our case. So the alphabetic orthography connecting to written graphings, those are the letters, but they correspond to phonemes. So we're making the link between graphing and phonemes, letter and sound. An approach or type of reading instruction that links these two is phonics instruction. So when you hear about alphabetic understanding and the alphabetic principle, orthographic processing solidly sits within this context. It's really to understand that it's how readers store written words in memory for effortless retrieval. And that's where we get into this piece. If you've heard about both phonological recoding and phonological encoding, orthographic processing here is working this whole system. So when we're reading, we start with seeing a word in print, right? When we read text like the word man. Then we take that word and separate it into its component parts, right? So I see the word man and I see now an M, an A, and N, orthography, right? I'm taking it apart. Now I'm translating it into a sound. So my orthographic processor is working with my phonological processor. So M is and A, N. So now I'm working both together. And then I'm blending. So we're working our phonological processor. And now I come up with a referent man and I'm accessing that in memory. And by accessing it in memory, I understand that man is a man, but then I need to figure out, is it the guy who lives next to me? Is it my neighbor? Is it the president of the homeowners association? Is it the president of the United States? All that is determined by context. What's key to understand is that phonological encoding is helping support orthographic processing and solidify these connections in memory. So if I'm asked to spell the word man, look at how the process is reflected. To spell the word man in my head, I then have to take that apart and spell man, and I'm blending, right? I'm trying to get that, those sounds, phonological processing. I then get those separate sounds after blending. I get the and then I write them, converting them into the component letters. That's your orthographic piece there, and then writing the word man. So the whole idea here with phonological encoding and recoding is, if those of you immersed in this and understand orthographic mapping, that's what we're talking about right here. This is the process of sounding out, recoding, spelling, encoding, and then when I work both sides of the chain, that's the orthographic mapping. That's the additional reinforcement that kids need to really solidify these letter patterns in their brain, right? These words, the phoneme graphing, mapping in their brains. So with phonological processing, I want you to look to see if students have weaknesses in their mind's eye. So hold on, it's not vision. Mind's eye is how students process the orthography of words. It's like, as Daniel said, it's not my vision. It's how my brain processes. I'm amazed he could, he told us, right? Told us this in this way. It's exactly what we're talking about here. It's your mind's eye, not your vision. It's how that mind's eye or your orthographic processor looks at the phonetic rules of spelling. And if you have difficulty applying that, that could be an issue with orthographic processing. If you're reversing letters within a word, you don't have those letters solidified in your brain. That's a reflection of difficulty with orthographic processing. Sight word recognition difficulty. Slow, sloppy handwriting, like Michael probably would exhibit, is also because these connections, these images, this orthography is not clearly solidified in the brain. I don't have it in my brain. It's not going to come out by hand. It's not solidified in my brain. It's not going to come out fluently and clearly by hand. Reversing letters for the same idea. Yes, they are, like a B and D is very similar, but because I don't have that pattern of the letter, what makes a B different from and distinguished from a D, those subtle nuances my brain's not seeing. My brain can't differentiate. So that's a sign of orthographic processing difficulty. Trouble copying, because that means I see something on the board or on the screen, and then if I were to put it in my notebook, for example, I can't hold onto it long enough to have a clear translation of that interpretation. So if I can't copy it, I don't have the patterns there. So I want you to understand that. I have a really great example here of a lesson. I'm going to stop my share that I think represents that whole idea of orthographic processing really well. It's a lesson from an early reading program called Early Reading Intervention. And it just has a very strong orthographic connection to instruction. Let me show you that. It's in your resource packet, but I'll share my screen here, give you a glance of what that looks like. Here's our packet, right, for our resource packet. And I'm going to just scan down. So bear with me while I scan down to the correct page. So the lessons here on page 8 of that packet. And you can see, I'll just make it a little bigger for you here, not smaller, but bigger. This is a lesson that includes 3 components. It includes a writer's warm-up. So this is intended for young kindergarten or first graders, where I'm introducing a letter, having them practice writing it. Then I'm integrating the phonological and alphabetic. So it's choosing the letter that matches a picture's first sound kind of thing. And then I do some basic spelling. Basic spelling starts with writing a letter's first sound. And so that's there. But watch as I scan down here. I'm going to just let you look at this a little bit here. I'm going to try to adjust it so it fits on the whole screen. And I want you to look, we're just practicing writing that letter. And I want you to look at this lesson. What makes this really support a student's orthographic processing? There's some neat instructional features here that go above and beyond just write the letter T, right? Watch me, I'm going to write T, now you write T. It kind of takes it beyond that. Take a moment and look. Specifically at steps 6 through 11. And when you're ready, you're welcome to share in chat any observations you have. I'm going to highlight some of the keys here so you can see them. Right, that's a key here. At least for me, you might be finding others, but these are key part of instruction. Watch as I write the letter. I start at the dot and write the letter. So in this particular lesson, there's starting dots to help kids know where to begin that formation. So if I know where to begin a letter, it's helping my brain make distinctions. A B starts somewhere different than a D. So that tiny little prompt is helping kids understand that the letter formation has a specific way to produce it. So in the lesson, you'll see here that they practice writing the letter, right? They're doing a folding over their paper so they can't see the model T, and they're writing it from memory. So either flipping their paper over, folding it in half, writing from memory. Wow, this is challenging their brain to say, okay, what does your mind's eye say a T is like? Write it now on your own. And then finally, do your letters look the same? So now we're helping young kids with orthography. Look at your T compared to the model T. Are they the same? And by doing that, we're asking their little brains to make distinctions. Is my T close enough? Is it the same? So any reflections you have there about orthography that you are seeing, and absolutely the instruction. I'm glad you've noted that for sure. Just something the kids here at Tier 3 require. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for the note about explicit instruction and modeling. So let me just go back over and let's talk about our last area of processing, which I believe we can do in about 5 minutes. So we can keep on pace to present the language part in the first part 1 of our afternoon, and then come to instructional matching in the second part of our afternoon. So we just looked at that example. So semantic meaning processing. So I want to take you in the same direction when you think about semantic meaning processing as you do when you are thinking about phonemic awareness and phonological processing. Meaning occurs at different modalities and levels. So look at how we process meaning. We have listening comprehension, it's reading comprehension. We have to express orally our ideas in a cohesive, coherent way, so whoever's listening can get a sense of what we're saying, and it does include written expression as well. And here is the continuum. So we have subword level for meaning, right? In terms of morpheme or morphological awareness, we have an understanding of what a word means, right? Mud, for example, in the early examples I shared, multi-word clausal syntax, putting mud with a pig, and then maybe multi-syntactic discourse telling a story about the pig. So meaning can break down in a variety of ways for kids. Look at this, it's across different functions of language, and it also cuts down in terms of different levels as well. So kid like Aubrey very clearly has difficulty with semantic meaning processing. Look at where I have to figure out where the breakdowns are. Listening, reading, oral expression. I think we know that from listening to Aubrey. Written expression, but also where is that breakdown? And we have to look at that further. I want to just note that for our secondary students, the morphological processing piece is so central here. And if students have difficulty with morphological processing, if they have difficulty reading multisyllabic words, it's an indication of some struggle at this subword level of meaning. And so providing some very detailed instruction to those students about how all that works is key. So I do have that note here about morphological processing. So when students have difficulty with meaning in the younger grades, we're looking and listening for things where students have trouble with word combinations and sentences and expressive language, difficulty putting words together in conversation, following directions, right, receptively related to language, oral instructions, expressing ideas in oral language, oral reading of passages, understanding the text that they might read independently, listening or reading comprehension is impacted in oral and written expression. And I think at least Aubrey, we would say, probably presents with some of those difficulties. So students in the upper grades, this checklist sort of hones in on the morphology, the use of prefixes and suffixes and the implications there. So for those of you working with those students, this is kind of your supplement to figuring those kids out and then helping direct instruction. So since I'm right at time, what I want to do is put this into context and then have you mull over it and bring back questions after your break. So what we're seeing now is we've built a model of reading based on processing. This four-part processing model originated from Marilyn Adams' work. So I cite her as original citation, and it's been expanded and enhanced, and really our field has added details here to it over time. But what has remained central are the processors involved in reading. And so if you look from left to right, we think about language input from the phonological processor, right? Where you're hearing my speech now. On the right to the left, as a reader, I start with my orthographic processor and I look at the print and read the words from that print. It kicks to the phonological processor where I now have to associate what I see in print to speech sounds. Once I sort of work through the two, and now I'm looking at the link in the middle of the page, the arrow that connects phonological and orthographic and the phonics, that's the back and forth between those processors. Once I get that and I figure out my word, it kicks up to meaning. And as I gave you the example with man, I don't just leave it there. I've got to take it up a level to context to be able to put that into a venue that makes sense. So what I want you to really think about, processors in isolation are important. We want to know how the brain's processing sound and print and meaning, but the way that they work together, we can't disconnect them. right? We can't, in the reading, we can't take them apart. And so I want you to be able to see what each side of this model is, but also how connected they are. And so with that, I'm gonna just stop here. We are going to, I want you to mull over that. Here's where we are. We built the whole idea of that language is based on a continuum, and that's where we're finding difficulties for our tier 3 readers are with phonological processing, orthographic processing, and semantic meaning processing. And when students have these difficulties, they're impacted in different ways. They have a different manifestation depending on where and how much and where the processing needs are. All of it goes into a model for reading. And what we'll do when you get back from break is take this now and apply it to instructional profiles, which leads us to instructional mapping. So we're right there where we want to be to get to the instruction piece and the matching part. That is really key for implementation. So enjoy your break. I'm looking at the time. I'm a couple minutes over. So we'll come back at how about 2:33? We'll start back at 2:33. So enjoy, step away, and I'll connect with you in a little bit. I'm going to reconvene and get us all back again for this part 2. So now let's really take what we've talked about and move into interventions. And to do that, I want to talk about instructional profiles. This is just a way to help us conceptualize the students that we might be working with and thinking about for tier 3 instruction. It essentially is a way to organize our thinking. So let me move back over to the PowerPoint and get us going from there. And we will have some more examples to share and talk about together. So here we go. And oh, got the wrong presentation. I did one this morning. Some of you all might have been with me. So that was from that. Let me get us to our correct presentation, and here we go. Okay, so let's look at what these student profiles are and how they can guide our instructional matching, where we head to intensification. So one of the things I want you to be aware of is, or a person I want you to be aware of is Virginia Berninger. She's a leader in our field related to the study of language-based disorders in reading, prolific researcher in our field. She's done amazing work connecting the neuroscience to the instruction, which definitely sits right where we are today, thinking about how to understand students who require tier 3 instruction a bit better. I highly recommend her work. The middle book in particular, the middle one you see there, Teaching Students with Dyslexia, Dysgraphia, and Oral Written Language Learning Disabilities, that's the OWL. That is the updated version of the text on the left, the green book. So looking, if you want to get a resource from today that aligns with the content, if you're really interested in this work, I highly suggest that middle selection. Virginia Berninger is now retired, though she is still consulting in the field, so we still continue to benefit from her work. Why I'm introducing her here is because the model of instructional profiles that I'm going to talk to you about next really is derived from her work, her thinking, and her research. So that's central to the model of how we're going to conceptualize and frame things. So I want to attribute the credit to her work. So back to where we are in the problem solving steps. So we looked, let's just say we looked at our tier 1, tier 2 data, and we've confirmed that our student hasn't made the progress that we expect from them. We've generated a hypothesis about why that might be. So for example, using my think about your student checklists might guide us to that. And then we've worked, let's say, with our school psychologist to do a more in-depth diagnostic assessment. And based on that diagnostic assessment, we're going to generate additional hypotheses about why students might be struggling based on skills mastered and not mastered. So we're right here in the process around steps 2 and 3. So here's instructional profiles and how I'd like you to think about them. I've noted on the top that this framework, this conceptual framework, is based on Virginia Berninger's work. It specifically aligns with a diagnostic assessment that she's created and is lead author of, called Process Assessment of the Learner, or PAL2. But I want you to just, this helps us organize it and helps us give access to figuring out the instructional matching, which is why I want to look at it with you. So everything sits in language, as we talked about, right? Oral language, yes, but more layered on is how students are processing that language. So the first learner profile on the bottom is this bottom part of the triangle. Those students have trouble with all three processing components we spoke about. They have difficulty with the phonological and orthographic processing. In addition to that, they have trouble with morphological processing and syntax, meaning they have trouble with meaning. And so you've got the complete complex picture of everything there working together to create challenge, right? So difficulty with phonological, hearing those sounds in spoken words, accessing the print and having that solid mind-eye connection with those letter patterns, the sequences of letters. Phonological and orthographic are so connected, so those two may not be talking to each other in the way we'd like in the brain. And then in addition to that, foundationally, there's trouble with oral and written language, reading and listening comprehension. So it's a real complex picture. These students, if you look on the far right, tend to have what we think about as oral and written language learning disabilities. And I, think about Aubrey. So potentially think about Aubrey. So the second learner profile are for students who have trouble primarily in the phonological orthographic area at the word level, with word level reading. So just trouble associating or hearing sounds in spoken words, right? That auditory processing piece, the phonological processing piece, but connecting it then to print. So difficulty with spelling, word level reading. These students tend to have dyslexia. They, unlike the students in Learner Profile 1, have some comprehension skills. For example, listening comprehension. They are able to hear a story read aloud, right, through an through an auditory, auditory listening to text. They can hear a story out loud in the classroom. They'll get the gist of the meaning. So their comprehension difficulty, unlike number 1, will be with reading comprehension. Listening comprehension's usually all right. Finally, at the top are students with the orthographic difficulties. These students we tend to think of those students as having dysgraphia. So those students they center very much in the orthography. So the ability to get from the brain, the print that we encode the mind's eye, right? The sequence of letters, what words are solidly stored as what real words are. Trying to get that information out by hand is very difficult. They're having trouble in their brain's mind eye making distinctions between letter formations, letter combinations. And so their print and their written expression is very slow and laborious. So that a real primary centers on that orthographic processor. There can be spelling difficulties here, but they're different than the spelling difficulties the students with dyslexia might have. Their spelling difficulties for Learner Profile 3 deal with the sequence of letters and words. So they might write or spell a word with phonologically plausible, meaning if I sound it out, what they've written is right, but the letters aren't, right? The letters are representing a phonologically plausible spelling, but it's not the accurate spelling. Their difficulty is more orthographic in nature. So we've got these 3 learner profiles to consider. It does get complicated. It does, because we're in the real world. Kids are complicated. So I want to tell you about some complications. Before that, though, let's look at prevalence for a minute. This triangle is organized based on complexity. It's not based on prevalence. So learner profile 1, most complex because all 3 components of processing that we talked about here are implicated, most complex. The next level up, phonological and orthographic, tend to be students with dyslexia. We see students struggle with the phonological and orthographic components of our language. We're looking at about 15 to 20% of a student population have phonological orthographic challenges with reading and writing, 15 to 20%. And I know that's large, but what I want to make a note here about, so one thing we know is that a lot of students have trouble phonological and orthographic processing. They may or may not be identified with dyslexia and receive special education, because if we have a system, a multi-level tiered support system that addresses their needs, gosh, if I have, in general, knowing that 15 to 20% of a student population has this challenge, then I'm going to build my instruction up at the tier 1 and tier 2 level to address that optimally. Then I will have fewer students identified for special education services with dyslexia. So it's a part of that is a systems level issue here. Also true, like if that instruction tier 1 and tier 2 is solid and robust enough to address the needs of students, they may have dyslexia but will never require special education. So we want to look at, I like the lens of instructional profile or learner profile, because we may or may not end up with the identification based on how robust our instruction is within our system. Right. So for learner profile 3, dysgraphia, there's such a range and prevalence there because 4 to 20%, we start to see dysgraphia become an issue as students begin writing. So we don't see it in the early grades as much because we don't have, we're not using written expression to the extent we do in later grades. And so there's that prevalence range there. But it just shows, I think, insight to us, takeaway, big picture today, that we can do a lot, even though we're talking about tier 3 today, we can do a lot at the tier 1 and tier 2 level to address phonological and orthographic needs of students, and then have the additional matching and instructional intervention for tier 3 support within the context of a system. So I mentioned complications, and here's one. I have to tell you that our understanding of students continues to emerge. And so just I want you to be aware of that some researchers, some leading thinkers in our field think of dyslexia as more of the bottom 2 profiles integrated together. So I just want you to be aware of that. I think it helps to keep the 3 separate just conceptually as we build instructional matching, but the reality is we're still learning about the needs of our students and what the characteristics of what their characteristics of. And I know the question comes up too, can you have dyslexia and dysgraphia, for example? And the answer is yes. So now, just because of that, we end up, with some combinations that become more complex for students. Yes, you can have both, and it just layers the complexity onto our understanding of students. So that's all. I think moving forward, let's keep these 3 discrete. It is your entry point to understanding students. Once you have that entry point, you can start to weed around into those complexities a little bit. So I wanted to just show you this. This is really how we've laid it out. So we're coming back to where we started in the beginning, understanding where the students we heard at the beginning of our session sort of fit. I wanted you to hold those in your head, and here they are, now matched to instructional profile potentially in areas of need. And then the final thing, I'm such a, I'm an easy target for a good visual graphic to help me understand something. And I really do think we've got that tier, our multi-tiered systems of support. Traditionally, we see the triangle to represent those 3 tiers of instruction. And I really think about tier 3, that top part of the triangle pulling out, and this is what we're working with. So if that helps you think about it, I don't know, it does as I contemplate it. So I want to work with you a little more on this. I really, really want you to understand Instructional Profile 1, which is the bottom, the most complex, sort of represented by Aubrey. 2, phonological-orthographic with Daniel, that's dyslexia, and orthographic processing, which is with Michael, dysgraphia. So in your resource packet, you have additional information here, and I want you to know it's there, but there's no need to look at it. You can stay with me here in our webinar and take some time to read these bullets. What I've done is I've taken some notes from Virginia Berninger's work. I wanted to use the technical terminology with you, right out of the research, right out of what experts think and how they describe students. And I want you to access it. I want you to see that you can understand and interpret what all this means into terms that relate to how we would think about these students. So just for a moment, I want you to read more about Instructional Profile 1. This is where a bottom, more complex, morphological, syntactical. That means the meaning piece is there, that where there's challenge, as well as phonological and orthographic. So just take a look at this, the language here on the screen. I'll be quiet and I'll let you kind of read through it. And what are your observations? What are your takeaways here about Learner Profile 1? Are you seeing anything jump out at you that adds to your understanding about who these kids are? So essentially what we'll ask you to do in the chat is put this into your own words. So what is characteristic of these students? Put it in your own words. And when I prompt you, hold your ideas. When I prompt you, I'll ask you to respond in the chat with your interpretation. It's basically, I'm asking you to write a gist statement for those of you who are in the comprehension world. So read this and come up with a gist statement of what is characteristic of these students. Give you some time. And if you have any questions about this, or you want me to interpret, please also let me know in the chat. And so whenever you're ready, please enter into the chat just your summary. It's a 1-sentence summary, 2-sentence summary of what you're seeing here for the children with all areas of processing that we've talked about implicated. So they have challenges with morphological, syntactical understanding. That's your meaning piece, the phonological and the orthographic of word reading and writing. So please respond in chat and get that started. If you have any questions about some of these terms or would like me to interpret or do something out loud thinking, I'm happy to do so. Yeah, I'm gonna just stop share to see if anything's coming up in chat. Good, thank you. Sarah's starting us off. Thank you, Sarah. Great. And I saw a question, is that what's the age of the student? Is that Aubrey specifically? I don't know Aubrey's age. Is a represent sort of the representative student with this, but she's definitely young, emerging reader. My sense is first, maybe. And then what I'm showing you now isn't representative of any age. It's the general profile. This is the description of the general profile for profile 1. Yes, can I call out Brittany for a minute? Brittany's comment is what is so central here, and I want you to hang on to this. It's the oral and the written language. It's the oral and the written language that both is impacted, oral and written modalities. One of the things we're looking at here too is the comprehension piece. It's listening and reading comprehension. So you have oral and written language, listening and reading comprehension. Oral language tends to be the driver here. Oral language is sort of driving the difficulty, so they're manifested across all of the processing areas we've talked about. So you're really looking closely at this, and I appreciate it. And you can see, thank you, Jan, that if I have these struggles with reading, it's gonna be so pervasive, right? It's gonna be so pervasive and impact it's like it's learning. This is learning, and so this is now impacting learning. So huge impact. On the whole picture, reading, writing, comprehension. You're all finding it in this, and I appreciate that. So really got to get a sense of what that learner profile was. Learner profile 1 is, and let me show you learner profile 2. I have intention here to show you what the language is like. So again, we're not describing a student specifically. This describes it's kind of like a description for any student who falls in this learner profile. These are things we're thinking about, right? Things we might observe, or we might get more information about from our diagnostic assessment. So let's look at profile 2 now. It's the phonological and orthographic profile. So these are students tend to have dyslexia, like Daniel. I'd like you to scan this and just note what you're seeing here. What are hallmarks? What are the standouts here related to this second profile? And I'll just do a think out loud with you here. So when you see phonological or orthographic loop, that essentially is those two processors talking to each other. It's your phonological and orthographic processor, how those things are looped and connected. And remember, I showed you the big picture model of the processors, and I told you one couldn't be extracted or isolated from the other, that they both communicated. And so this is an example of how you'll come up and see language. When you see loop, it's essentially connections, meaning connections in the model. So I'm going to let you, take another minute or two and look at it, and then let's start. What are the hallmarks here of learner profile 2? And I see, excellent. And yes, neurobiological in origin is dyslexia, right? It's a neurological way that connected to how we process language. Yeah, and thank you for noting the oral language skills. Absolutely. So like Daniel, right? Really great oral language skills. But when it comes to the word level reading and putting the phonological piece with the orthographic piece, that's where we have extreme difficulty and struggles. So those two, like this is word level reading, it's essential down to that level, word level spelling. And so if I have word level reading and spelling level difficulties, it means I'll have some reading comprehension trouble potentially, right? Because if I'm reading in text, I may may not be able to get the words correctly, so it will impact my reading comprehension. But as you saw here, listening comprehension is good. Listening comprehension is good, and you're all remarking on that, which makes me happier seeing those patterns. Wonderful, you all. I really, really understanding and knowing who these kids are is part of instructional matching. So we're going to do one more, and then we'll move to matching. Back to my slide. So let's take a look now at the last description here. Get on orthographic. So orthographic difficulties, dealing more with the written production of text. I did highlight to you that spelling can be impacted, but for different reasons. So I will let you take a look here. And whenever you're ready, you may just start with your highlights. What are hallmarks, putting this into your own words, of a student with orthographic processing challenges? Yeah, when you're ready, you can start. What is central to these students and where they have a challenge? Yeah, difficulty transcribing text and writing. It's the writing piece that is real key here. And I love, thank you, Amy, for calling out the idea of it's not necessarily the motor problem itself. No, right? It's more about how the brain is processing the written text. And if my brain isn't seeing that, mind's eye is associated with the orthography. That means it's hard for my hand to produce it. It's very, right? The connection is there. It's very much writing. So I think, yes, it's that orthographic, the translation of text. It's the mind's eye of seeing the letters, the letter combinations here that is so central. And you've got it here. Spelling also. Spelling can be a problem, but the spelling, if you look and analyze spelling errors, for those of you who might be letters trained or have that experience, you will find that students with dysgraphia have orthographic leaning errors in their spelling. Their spellings are phonologically plausible. So that's a hallmark, is to look at spelling errors here. Deeper level of detail. You excellent. Thank you. You all are great. Let me layer in a couple quick things, and we'll get right to how we sort out instructional profile. I mean, it's the matching. We'll sort out how we're going to do the matching. So a couple add-ons here. One of the things I want you to understand, a couple of you picked up, the neurobiological nature of language-based challenges is a real thing. We think of this as brain-based. So if it's brain-based processing challenges, they are neurobiological in origin. One of the things, if you noticed, on each profile, when I put up Virginia Berninger's notes, you saw executive functioning. So I want you to know that for all three profiles, students can have executive functioning challenges. It just is by magnitude or degree. How much, what are the nature of those executive functioning challenges? So for all three, sort of an overlay here is the issue of executive functioning, right? And what that means. So strength with executive functioning means I have a goal direct, my behavior is goal directed, it's focused, it's integrated, right, in my learning. When I don't have that, and when I have challenges with executive functioning or deficits here, I have some of these behaviors. I may not self-direct and use strategies to help get through a task or accomplish a task. I don't have that focus. So inattention, right? Keeping my direction, difficulty taking in and receiving new information, trouble monitoring my own learning. So I'm hoping as you think about students who might have these leanings towards in profile 1, 2, or 3, that you might overlay and consider what is the level of executive functioning. Again, I say it's degree of magnitude. Some students, you may not see this present as much, others you really see it present, right? And there's everywhere in between. One thing I just want to note is working memory sort of fits within this. And with working memory challenges, it's not something we remediate per se, but we always support working memory in our instruction through instructional supports. Working memory, just hold on to that for a little bit. Working memory has additional impact in making the orthographic, the phonologic, the morphological meaning processing of language more difficult. It just adds difficulty to that. So I kind of connected you to the memory piece here, the self-regulation, right? Am I focused on my goal learning? Do I know how to get through my assignment? What's my step 1, step 2, step 3? Also how I feel about myself and my own learning is wrapped up into all of this. So just know that executive functioning is part of what we're talking about when we talk about tier 3. And because the learning challenges and continuum language-based disorders we're talking about are neurobiological in origin, this just maps onto it, and it's about degree. Now, part 2 I want to add. So that was 1, adding to all, like adding to the picture of all 3 instructional profiles. So my next piece to add is to the orthographic and phonological profile. So profile 2, I want you to give you just a little bit more information here. These are the students who may have dyslexia. They have trouble with the orthographic and phonological processing at the word level. What I want you to know about these students is, yes, there are other coexisting difficulties that we see, right? We've talked about some of these other things here. So what I want you to be aware of is those students can have dysgraphia. So we've talked about that. We've talked about language, right, in the greater perspective. Executive functioning, I just added. ADHD can be an add-on here. Dyscalculia, Daniel mentioned his trouble sometimes with mathematics. So knowing that with the profile 2, we might have some, things that muddy the waters and make it more complicated. One piece I want you to be aware of is something called rapid automized naming. Let me just describe this for you. It's not a skill you teach. It's something that you might explore through diagnostic assessment. It's determining whether students are able to fluently move from one code or another, meaning that if I show a set of pictures, the students can look visually at what that code is, and the code essentially is a picture. And then can they connect to the auditory to be able to orally express the name of that picture? So they're switching in the case of if I see a printed letter on the page, they're switching from the code of identifying that letter, right? What is it, to its name. So I'm coding, right, back and forth. The ways we assess this in our work are presenting, this is now from the assessment side, non-instruction, is I might ask students to tell me the name of these pictures after I make sure they know what those pictures are and what their names are. So a student who would be, yeah, I got it, ball, star, hand, dog, chair, hand, chair, so forth. A student who might have trouble with what I'm labeling as code switching would just have this pause here to get that picture identified and then expressed. So I'm looking at that. It's a ball. Star is just this like little bit of a hesitation here. And you can get at this through our letter naming or letter numbering tasks. It's essentially underlying this rapid automized naming feature and whether that's present for students. What I want you to know is if that is present, if students have difficulty code switching, and code, not language. I'm not talking about language switching. I'm talking about the code of moving from a picture or object to my ability to label it. If there's difficulty there, we're looking at something that our field has termed double deficit, meaning you have the deficit with the phonological and orthographic, but you also have this difficulty with automized naming. And if this is present, I want you to understand three things. Number one, that this exacerbates and makes phonological processing along with phonics and fluency more difficult for kids, right? Because they're trying to connect these things in this process of code switching. It's also more difficult to treat, not impossible by any stretch, but then these, you're really looking at some more intensive supports for these students. And then finally, if this is present, it makes students more at risk for both reading and writing difficulties. It's just an awareness that comes up in your assessment. I can't give you prevalence on that. I also, because our field is still trying to identify what this means and what the implication is and define it further. So I have to say our field is still learning, but it's something to watch for as we talk about intensive intervention. So big picture, because I'm not going to take you in instructional matching. So just get the visual in your head. One of my objectives is to have you walk out of the session with this visual where we have learner profile 1 with all 3 areas of processing involved. Learner profile 2, students who tend to have dyslexia, phonological and orthographic processing, more dealing with text, written text, the dysgraphia piece. That's what you're thinking. And I just gave you an overlay. I said that all 3 learner profiles, neurobiological in origin, because we're talking about processing, that means executive functioning could occur, challenges there. And that is just magnitude of degree, depends on the kid. Then I said a little bit more about learner 2, profile 2, that often connects with other things. You also see that present with other things. So you have to problem solve through that. And I wanted you to be aware of where and how rapid automized naming comes into that picture. So real pause. This is just a pause to make sure you've got it before moving forward. I'm going to make sure that you've got this in mind and visually in your head, and with the additional considerations I just added. Just going to pause, be quiet for a minute or two, let you process any questions, because now we're going to instructionally match. So take a moment to reflect on our framework. I'm going to come over and check. How are you all doing? Thumbs up. Good. Good. Ready for instructional matching? Awesome. Okay, here we go. So this is our hard work has led us to this. So let me build this out now. So with instructional matching, you're essentially thinking about how instruction can be intensified. And so with instructional intensification, I just want you to know that our instruction at tier 3 increases in density, right? What we want to do is provide more and better explicit instruction, more and better modeling. So the model of tier 3 just amps up all that great explicit, direct, systematic instruction that hopefully is in place at tier 1 and tier 2. So you're really looking at more and better. That's at its core instructional density. So what I'm going to do is focus on programs and practices that you might see at tier 3 for instructional matching, but the how of delivery is really important. And that's what this is. So I just need to put that in to define what instruction is. We're here at number 4 now, selecting interventions. And I want you to know that optimally, selecting an evidence-based program is the route to go, because tier 3 is so complicated. The time it takes to put piece things together is really challenging. And if there are programs that you can use that are of high quality and aligned with the instruction that your students need, that's the route we take. It's called standard protocol approach, right? We want to be able to follow a program that really gives us good guidance around implementation. It's not to say that we can't infuse evidence-based practices. That's important, especially when it comes to supports around executive functioning. If we have a little time, I might do some show and tell that with that. We'll see. And so essentially what you're really looking at is customizing a treatment plan or an intervention plan for students based on their needs. So your process for here, number 4, selecting an intervention, I like to break that down further into a few steps. I think it's helpful to break that out. So when I select an intervention, I start with my diagnostic assessment. And I'm asking myself, does that diagnostic assessment tell me if students require language, meaning more the oral expressive language, spelling and reading, transcription and or composition, comprehension instruction, and then I've got a tool for you to use to take that information into a specialized instructional diet for your students. You're really thinking about what programs or practices align now with those student needs. And then the 4th consideration, I call it micro and macro skills. So in writing, your micro skills are your letter writing, your sentence writing, and your macro skills are your composition. In reading, your micro skills are your foundational reading skills, and your macro skills is your comprehension. So what we have to think about with our students is how to integrate those things, even though students might have greater need and the emphasis of instruction should be on the word reading foundational skills. We want to functionally connect those two things. We want to functionally connect it to the macro so that students are being able to transfer their skills to reading. So those are the considerations. Let me take you through some examples. So we've got this model, right? Learner profile 1 is on the bottom, learner profile 2 in the middle, and learner profile 3 at the top. Here's your intervention menu aligned with that framework. I'm thinking about language, right? We saw how important that oral language was for learner profile 1. So if you look there, that's semantic meaning processing. I have spelling reading considerations. Why spelling reading? And I hinted at the spelling when I showed you phonological encoding and recoding. Spelling is a venue, a way to really help students see how words work. And so for word level reading challenges, that spelling area, which is essentially teaching the reading, is the other bucket to really consider. That aligns with your phonological and orthographic processing. So you're looking at some instruction with some phonological awareness, word reading, word spelling. We have transcription and sentence writing. So for students who have orthographic processing needs, transcription means getting words on the page by handwriting or keyboarding. It's getting the words out and the sentences out from my brain onto paper or computer screen. That orthographic processing piece there, the tracing, copying, and memory components are essential in that instruction, a little bit like I showed that early reading intervention lesson to you. Finally, on the next bucket over, comprehension and composition. So yes, some students have comprehension needs, right? So a student like Aubrey would need this comprehension. Composition, a student with dysgraphia would require the composition, but these are the macro skills. So some students will have this emphasized, others will have it as a way to functionally integrate. So that would be de-emphasized, but still allowing the practice and transfer of those comprehension skills. So that's kind of that bucket. And on the far right are just other supports we consider and we overlay or integrate here into our model. So this is your tier 3 intervention menu. I want you to see it's very aligned with the profiles we're talking about already. So looking at that a little bit, this is kind of what I use to build interventions or think about how to match instruction at tier 3. Part of this is, again, degree of emphasis, and I just want to put this point home. We really want to create an instructional diet that makes sense for our students. And so I think today I'm going to be thinking about individual student and what they need, but so many of your students will have similar patterns of needs. That's where at tier 3 you can make those small groups that align with, a lot of kids will have phonological orthographic processing challenges. So they will line up, but just for sake of simplicity, I'm going to take you through how to think about this for an individual student. So 2 things, degree of emphasis, right? And how we want to make sure those skills are transferring. So we want to strategically combine micro and macro in a single lesson, right? We want to hit the lower order and higher order processes involved in reading and writing. But again, we have many students who the majority of your instruction has to be so tight on phonological and orthographic processing. We just need a little bit to help them transfer, right? So degree of emphasis. So I've got my menu. This is where I start. And now based on diagnostic information, I'm going to start to create instructional profiles for students. I'm going to start to figure out their needs. And so here's an example. So this represents now subtests on a diagnostic assessment. I'm starting with the PAL-2, the process assessment of the learner, because it's most aligned with the model we're talking about today. And I don't want you to look at language for a minute. Just look at the text in black font. So starting with spelling, reading, and moving to the right. On the PAL-2, there are subsections of that assessment that get at orthographic coding. Like these are the subtests. They're tagged: phonological coding, morphographic syntactic coding, verbal working memory, vocabulary. What I've done is I've aligned those subtests to the menu, to the bucket. So I've taken the subtests from that test and I've put them in. Which subtests align the most with spelling and reading? Which subtests align and tell me most about transcription? Which subtests get at comprehension and composition? So the PAL-2, what is available in the PAL-2 is reflected in the black font. If you scan to the left, the red font is what the PAL-2 doesn't cover. So PAL-2 is an assessment that really gets at the subcomponents of language and the processing of it. It doesn't as much deal with the larger units of language, oral language, expressive language, traditional reading comprehension, for example. So on the left in red, what I did for myself is say, okay, my PAL-2 doesn't get at that, but here's some information I need to work with my school psychologist or others in my building who might be doing assessment. I need to figure out how I'm going to get information on language. And that's how this is outlined. So let me take another example. So another diagnostic assessment we see, particularly with secondary kids, is the use of the test of written language, the TOWL. So what I've did, the same thing. So in black font are things that I'm getting from the TOWL. These are the subtests, exact subtests that align with the buckets here that I'm trying to figure out with students. What's written in red are some areas I feel like I need to kind of get more of. I need to figure out these things, and I may not have that information in this diagnostic assessment. So for example, the TOWL doesn't give a lot of phonological awareness. So I might want to add the test of word reading fluency there to get more at the word reading and the decoding. I don't have anything getting at transcription, even though it's a written language assessment. Transcription meaning getting those words on the page. So I might look at just my everyday curriculum-based measure, right? My timed writing samples, and how are my students doing on those timed writing samples, and those scores will provide insight. So that's it. What diagnostic assessment is used primarily in your building or your district? It does take a little work working and sitting with a school psychologist or assessment person, and aligning then the subtest with these areas, right? These buckets. What subtests are informing me about spelling, reading, transcription and sentence writing, comprehension and composition, and on the far left, language. So just pausing there, that's the step that you can take out the door today, is sort of to figure out what assessment's being used, what are the subtests there, and do you need to enhance this with other subtests. I just wanted to remind you that If you're working with English language learners and you're trying to figure some of this out, the WIDA model also has a pretty comprehensive language assessment you can look at, which might inform that far left piece. So again, working with the menu, working with our menu here, I'm trying to get down to the instructional mapping. I have to take that information from my diagnostic assessment and then move to program. So what I've done is I've put together some commonly recommended programs that I think for example, that Patton will often use in consulting, that I often use in my consulting. They're not the only programs that align by any stretch, but this just gives you an idea of the sorts of things we're looking at here related to grades K through 3. So with semantic meaning processing, I have the read aloud small group curriculum listed there. That's a program that's been rated highly in all areas of research on the National Center on Intensive Intervention website. RAVO is another common program that will help support with this language piece. You'll see some other examples of phonological and orthographic processing in that next bucket, and then transcription. In sentence writing, orthographic processing piece, some writing programs. Something that kind of pulls comprehension together is listed on the far right. Again, not exhaustive by any stretch. I just give in some examples. So I want to try, and I had a secondary one, and I'm not sure why that's not showing up. But I'll grab it if we don't cover it. Let's do some examples together though. So looking at the intervention menu, we're going to look at a 6th grader sample here with his or her needs. So my diagnostic assessment is telling me that they have considerable needs in language. The expressive language is slow and somewhat laborious. I often, from that diagnostic assessment, so I'm pulling down right from my diagnostic assessment that there's difficulty with word level reading and spelling. Phonological awareness at the phoneme level is an issue. So I'm starting to see a complex picture here. Nothing noted for transcription. Comprehension, listening comprehension is strong. Reading comprehension difficulties are looked to word reading levels. I'm starting to see, I'm going to do think aloud. I'm starting to see a strong learner profile too, but what's interesting is what's happening over there with language. So there's definitely language needs. So it's structural profile 2 plus more. Here it is. So I do have an example of some programs for grades 4 through 12. And so you can see these listed here. So now, knowing this is coming from my diagnostic assessment, I now know I have to build a program for the student that has some strong spelling reading piece, right? It has to have a language component. And what I need to do, I've got listening comprehension is strong and word comprehension is just linked to the word level reading areas. This is showing me that on the far left of my screen, I've got to have a diet that's language and spelling and reading. And I've got I don't have to have a component for comprehension per se, but I've got to do enough to help them practice transferring those word reading skills and context. So that's how I'm building my program. I'm looking at some supports here for semantic meaning processing. I'm looking at that second bucket there for phonological and orthographic processing, and a little bit of integration would be my map. So let's try some more examples. So learner profile 1, 2, and 3. I really want you to know 1 is most complex, 2 is phonological orthographic, and 3 is orthographic only. Let's take this approach and kind of look at some programs that already have been put together. Once we do that, I'll pause. I'll give you some time to look at the resources, and then I'll ask, answer questions too. So we're looking at this map again, the menu, intervention menu. It's what we're going with. I want you to look at that instruction. I know it's just a short amount of time, but who does this benefit? Writer's warm-up, which is strong, right? Orthographic, phonological orthographic here, and a phonological orthographic spelling piece there. So learner profile 1, 2, or 3, what instruction does this align with? 1, 2, or 3? And you can enter that into your chat. So I want to see the chat racing with instructional profile 1, 2, and 3. This kind of combination of instruction benefits who? And there can be a couple couple right answers. It's mostly one, but I would be accepting yes. It's mostly two. Remember, one's on the bottom, 2 and 3. So I would say 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and maybe 3 because of the writing. Yay. Awesome. Let me add something to this. Hold on. Let's come back over here. Great. So if I add now, let's add the read alouds with oral and written retells. So the read alouds, explicit and systematic, is really getting at building oral language. Now this is suited primarily for who? It's got an oral written language piece, so it's semantic meaning processing. It's got phonological and orthographic processing, and orthographic only because I'm writing. So I've just described who, and let's see if you all, yes. Number 1. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Because you now have everything in here. So I just want you to see this all from a different perspective. Awesome. Great. So let me move forward. Here's another schedule. This one's a little bit arbitrary, but I want you to know, I want to think about who this benefits. So I've got language. I've got a language intervention on Monday and Friday for the students. So immediately that puts me somewhere and on my learner profiles. I've got transcription. So that's orthographic. I've got spelling and reading, phonological and orthographic, and I'm constantly connecting it to composition and comprehension. So here we go. In the chat, 1, 2, or 3, the language is your key. 1, 2, or 3. Great. Thank you. Yes, it's number one. Perfect. So I'll let you keep putting in your response. Okay, the next one, this is changing. So I'm looking at, we've got some kind of transcription part, that program or component of my lesson that starts everything off here. Then I'm moving into spelling and reading. Notice that I'm just connecting it to comprehension on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Wednesday it's sentence level, then passage level Thursday and Friday. So we've got phonological orthographic and then orthographic with the transcription. It's phonological orthographic. Who does this benefit? Phonological orthographic and orthographic is there. I think comprehension is the functional integration. 2, 2, 2. Yeah. 2, 2, 2. If I got spelling and reading in this, it's solidly we're working to target those students who have phonological orthographic needs. Fabulous. Yes. And so my last one, you probably can figure out what this one is just by process of elimination, but look at how this one's structured with transcription running through the week. Again, kind of arbitrary. If these were interventions, this might be how I schedule things. So I've got transcription focused on spelling work on Monday and Friday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's more handwriting and mechanics, and the composition is my higher order, but it runs throughout. So this is writing, very writing focused. So you all got jumping in. Yes, 3. It is 3. It's our description. So now that's how I want you to think. I want you to be able to move from a diagnostic assessment down through the selection of an instructional diet, and then think about, if I might have a variety of programs, right? Because it's degree of emphasis. I might need a language program and I might need a spelling and reading program. And I'll have to think about how to schedule those and provide support to students. Again, degree of emphasis, as you saw by prevalence, we'll find many students with some of these same trends. So we're looking at the individual student level, but surely there are patterns that will lend themselves to some instructional groups to help target that intervention. So you did excellent. So what I want to do now is show you a couple of things. I'm going to stop my share. I want to show you 2 tools. And then I'm going to pause, and for about 5 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, 5 to 7 minutes, I want you to go through these materials and really take a look at them. And during that processing time, ask any questions in the chat that you like. So it's a chance to answer questions and look at materials. First thing I want you to show you is your resource packet. I just want to do a show and tell of what's here. In the appendix of your resource packet on page 20, there is a worksheet, essentially, a worksheet to help guide the process just as I described. So looking on page 20, you have the intervention selection template. And the first step, use your diagnostic assessment information to determine areas for your tier 3 intervention menu, right? So this box here, I'm going to just type some junk in here. That box there is for me to look at my diagnostic assessment and to start to list the subtests that I'm going to be using to inform whether or not students have areas of need. What assessment is funneling in here? So my junk type is to show you where you would do that. Then you administer that test, right, to students. And here's a place where you're highlighting results. So language, significant need and language expression, right, is here. However it breaks down. So this would be the spelling reading category, decoding difficulties, whatever performance information you're pulling from the test, spelling, in the areas of what, you can list specific letter patterns, but this is essentially what you're filling in based on the assessment itself. So once you've got this, you can highlight, circle, notes, you start to see those patterns, and now you're coming down to the intervention menu. So based on step 1, I know that for that student, like this is a need, I might see this is a need, this will do a complex student, this too. So now I know how to start to build that instructional diet down here. And I would just make notes like this is the need. Instructional diet, I might then cross-reference with the programs I showed you in the PowerPoint itself. I could say I could consider, Ravo or read aloud if it's an elementary kid. Those come down into those boxes. And then theoretically, I sort of work on the hard part, which is the scheduling. How is that going to be delivered? So listing what programs I'm using, right? There might be multiple because we're talking about degree of emphasis and need, area of need. And then how do those play out in a schedule? And when would those groups occur? But that's essentially a process. I wanted to give you just this little prompt to consider how you're connecting the foundational skills with the higher order skills, right? The lower order, higher order. For some kids, it's going to be a prevalent thing in your intervention, and it's because that's an area of need, right? The comprehension is an area of need. For others, it won't have the prevalence, but you have to consider about how you're connecting it related to transfer. So that's just it. This is your steps. So I just wanted to show you that that is a worksheet in your resource packet for you to use to guide this process. Yeah, I'll pause on this. I see this question come up. What's the difference between micro and macro? Yeah, so for reading, our micro skills are the foundational reading skills, right? They are your ability to process text and decode it. It's your word level reading skills. It's your basic foundational reading skills. Macro, higher order skills in reading are essentially comprehension, right? Comprehension, applying your micro foundational skills to comprehension. In writing, the writing part, what are your micro skills in writing? It's your handwriting, right? It's your word level production of words and sentences. It's your ability to write a sentence. That's micro, grammar, syntax. Your macro in writing is composition. It's putting that all together. And that composition could be a short paragraph of 4 sentences or a short paragraph of 3 sentences. Doesn't have to be a multi-paragraph essay to any extent, but it's your ability to take those micro skills and apply them. So micro and macro. And what we learned for tier 3 students, yes, there's a degree of emphasis. So clearly an Aubrey is going to require a lot of the comprehension. She's going to require both micro and macro. But a kid like Daniel, he will have a very micro-focused intervention, a very foundational skills-focused intervention on areas of word reading. What I want you to understand is that you do a little comprehension with him too, though, because I don't want him just to be reading in isolation and practicing his word reading and spelling. He's got to be able to transfer it in context, and kids need practice doing so. So that's that nuance of the conversation about comprehension and that integration. So let me show you one more tool, and I see additional questions coming in, which is wonderful. I'll kind of pool those and discuss after you have this chance to look at materials. So one more thing, I want you to see, if those of you, some of you may have attended my morning session, and if you didn't, totally okay. I want you to be aware of a new tool that can help you evaluate your system of multi-tiered systems of support. This new tool has been developed from the National Center on Improving Literacy. It will be posted on their website for use and with additional supports for use. And so this is a coming soon document. I want you to be able to access it, though. We are distributing it to groups and teams we work with through presentations as we are concurrently developing the web infrastructure to release it. So I know Donna will be putting this link in the chat. I'd love you to be able to access it. It's a Google Doc, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Once you access it, you can download it. That downloading essentially gives you a copy of what this tool is. It's a comprehensive evaluation tool that it lets you think about your system, what your multi-tiered support system looks like, what essential ingredients are a part of your system. Typically, you would fill it out with your leadership team or your building team within the context of multi-tiered systems of support. So it's a tool that you can use to evaluate or reflect on your system and use it for very helpful conversations about multi-tiered systems of support in general. For you, for this session, for Tier 3, I want you to know that within element number 1, the core instruction and intervention element, there's very specific information on Tier 3 that you can look and access. And so I will show you that in a moment. I'll take you to my Excel file so you can see that essentially how this tool is used is a team will complete reflection of their system. They will score each item as not in place, partially in place, or fully in place. Not in place might mean it's in place sort of, and might be really sketchy, and it's there might be 0 means there still could be a little bit of emerging things, but it's not nearly in place. So I want you to know 0 just doesn't mean like it's not there at all. Number 1 is truly partially in place, meaning that's an area that can be improved upon. It's emerging. You might have some things there. It just might not be consistent. And 2 is fully embrace it as implemented. So the idea of this is to have an honest reflection to complete this tool as a team within the context of a leadership team, and to evaluate your system and then use it as in an ongoing way to further reflect on implementation and use it to guide refinement of your system. So that's the scoring part. Let me show you what the tool looks like, and I'll take you to where the Tier 3 piece is. I'm going to open up my Excel file here. So I will make this bigger here. So this is the cover page. It gives you directions on how to save the tool, essentially your file, making a copy or downloading, depending on what system you have. There's additional information on this front page about the components, the elements of the tool. Element 1 is instruction, core instruction, and intervention, with items, again, of reflection. And if I scroll down, you'll see that Tier 3 is here, right? Tier 3 is here. And so I can fill out this in reflection about how my Tier 3 is operationalized. What do I have in place? What still needs to emerge? I can enter scores here in my checklist, which it's not doing for me here. There we go. And I can complete this checklist. You'll get automatic tallies as well. The group code means I'm going to be evaluating different components of this item 24. Anyway, it will fill out. You can fill it out based on reflection. But by the way, the P2 is priority 2. So the whole tool itself is based on 3 different levels of priority. Priority 1 are like the essentials, the infrastructure you need to do to get in place first. Priority 2 is for your next phase to tackle. So you can see that I'm in tier 2. Let me go down to tier 3. That tier instruction is considered an important priority. And so that is a P2. There's tier 3 right here. And then there's some priority 3, which are enhancement and refinements of your system. So it relates to tier 3, and I want you to see it. That's all. So you've got, let's do some processing time. And so let me flip you back over to the PowerPoint, and here's what I want you to spend about 5-ish, 7 minutes if needed looking at. Wrong. Hold on.
Lena,
Yes.
there was a question about assessments, and I know you talked about the tower as far as being an assessment for word reading, and all of the things that you have shared in the importance of having assessments are not for identification, they're for driving instruction. So if you have an MTSS process, which this tool really helps you develop, whatever assessments you're using as diagnostics is the way you do things. It's the way you inform your instruction. So that question about, can we legally give tests and assessments? Again, your purpose for this, at a tier 3, you've involved this family. You have family engagement, you have family connections. So what assessments you're using to inform your instruction to intervene are going to be up to your district, and they're going to be something that you will, you'll utilize. But things like the CTOP is great for phonological awareness. The tower was good for, the word reading. So there's lots and lots of assessments that are out there. I would consult with your school psych and as well as your speech and language at your district level on, what they recommend. They are the experts in your districts. But I did want to just address that before we went into looking at things.
Yeah, Donna, thank you. Thank you so much for framing that and making that clarification. Absolutely. So we are in process because I'm putting all this in the context of multi-tiered systems of support. And so part of this is your process, and diagnostic does not mean diagnosis. The two don't equate. Diagnostic is an assessment that identifies strengths and identifies areas of need. And that's the only way you can really get into the level of detail here to figure out what your where you will have a degree of emphasis, right, and match to instruction. So let me just bring you back over to that PowerPoint. And so I want you to just take some processing time and look at the materials. One is the checklist, and Donna helped provide the link to that in the chat. The second is that intervention planning template. Go to that resource packet and take a walk through that, and think about how you could take that tool out the door today to use it for tier 3 intervention planning. It's a worksheet, essentially. It's kind of gives you a worksheet. As you explore that resource packet, note in the appendix that we've aligned all sorts of programs and instructional intervention and books to read with area of need for students. Again, not exhaustive. If you could look at that, list was created in 2016 as part of our patent MTSS initiative work. It just gives you examples. So if a student has profound morphological processing difficulties, what are some things out there that give you an idea of the sort of instruction that might be linked to that area of need? So it's just a resource, gives you information to go look at. So I'll give you a few minutes. I really do want you to know what is there and how you can take it out the door. So I'll just pause there. I just want you to know what resources you have and some of the planning templates and worksheets that are available and align with the work we're talking about today. Tier 3 problem solving is so complex, and these kids are so complex. And so my goal was to give you a process, to give you something at least to navigate, help you step through it. And so that's there for you to guide you. So we're anchoring right fundamentally on the tier 3 problem solving process, but yet we're like looking at under the hood, if you will, of how we get to the intervention selection. So in our remaining time, I just want to highlight some other material in your PowerPoint that I won't spend time covering, but I want you to know is there. And then I'm going to just spend a little bit of time highlighting some executive functioning supports only for the purpose of that these apply across all categories of students that we've talked about today. All learner profiles might be the degree of magnitude that these supports are required, but they are something that you don't go to a program for. These are something you integrate within whatever program you're planning. And so that makes me want to sort of end with some highlights there, because executive functioning supports are about integrating, not a program to support the executive functioning. So anyway, let's go back to the PowerPoint and I'll pick things up from there just to look. So I'm going to go out of slide view and I want you to see my screen sharing has stopped. Hold on. Sorry. I'm going to go back over to my, and hopefully you can see my my organization view of the PowerPoint. And what I want you to look at is starting right after my discussion of the implementation checklist, here are some intensification practices. So these are just ideas for the practice aligned with some of the programs I mentioned. And so it's divided by area of processing. So you have, what does it mean when we intensify for phonological and orthographic processing? We really look closely at spelling, and there's some examples there. For semantic meaning processing, it's how to break out meaning at the word, sentence, and text level, and some examples there. And then what I want you to come to is this, the executive functioning piece. And I'm just going to run this quickly through a concluding kind of highlight. Remember, students with neurobiological challenges, processing challenges with language can have executive functioning difficulties, and they manifest it differently, right? They can manifest a lot. So students really struggle, or they manifest maybe not quite as much. The thing with executive functioning is we don't necessarily can't really remediate them completely, but we can provide support and tools and strategies for students. And that's key to understand that these things are not a program like, one of my word reading or spelling programs that I'm going to implement as an intervention. These are strategies that have to be integrated across the instruction that you're doing for students. They cluster around these three areas: supports for working memory. And I remember I told you working memory is so profound, because if I have those working memory challenges, it connects to how I process phonologically, orthographically, and at the meaning, morphological, semantic, syntactic level. Executive function relates to self-regulation as a learner, and just my overall ability to believe in myself, my own self-efficacy. And these are the three areas to pay attention to related to executive functioning supports. And this is so key. So I highlighted it on a slide by itself, is that they are integrated. They serve as an overlay, not as a component of instruction itself, or not as its own program. So let me go through three, and they're just to pique your thinking and give you ideas for takeaway. So if I have a student who struggles with working memory, they struggle because they're not quite able to efficiently spotlight their attention, right? So they have trouble sorting out what's important and what's not. But just think about the students we talked about today. Working memory could be sorting out, it's important that I do this homework assignment and not focus on video games, names. That's part of like focus. But working memory too can be at the level of, does the D look like a D or a B? And what are the distinctions? How do I focus on that? How am I focusing on that aspect of my learning? Working memory can be broad, big picture, but it also involves the language processing that we've talked about today, right? Ways to help support students. One of the things to help support memory and reinforcement is to get kids to do writing, to integrate the writing piece. So that writing part is powerful. So though I might have a student who is centered on learner profile 2 with phonological and orthographic needs, and I'm doing a lot of spelling and reading, if I'm having students write in addition to my reading and spelling practice, traditionally, if I'm having students write those spelling words, it is a way to reinforce memory of those words. So really think about writing. Writing is a wonderful way to support memory. When it comes to self-regulation, that means my ability to regulate my own learning and be very goal-directed here. What I'm thinking about are all the tools and supports you can provide related to outlines, procedural steps, how to focus attention from moving from step 1 to step 2, step 3. I'm really supporting regulation when I integrate things that are procedural. So helping clue students in on what's the first step when I decode a word? Like what happens in my thinking? What's the next step when I decode a word? Or spelling, what's the first step when I spell a word? Like helping students work through some of these more difficult the processing in a step-by-step manner helps with self-regulation so they're not all over the map. A couple examples from our National Center on Improving Literacy that apply to little guys is the use of bookmarks. So we created bookmarks for kids. And the one on the left was used in a tier 3 lesson to help kids understand explicit instruction, actually. We have a teacher modeling something or telling students what we're going to do. That's the what. Then they model something, then the kids practice, then they take individual turns. We had little guys sitting there kind of lost in the the process. So to help them focus on their learning, we wanted to clue them in to the components of the lesson, to what the phases or pieces of that explicit instruction was. So we had this bookmark and said, here are the pieces of the lesson. I'm going to say the what, we're going to watch, we're practicing correct and turn. So they could just have the little bookmark there and follow the process. Some of you use graphic organizers. One way to bring it down to the level of self-regulation is through a bookmark like this, where students are able to identify parts in the story or informational text. And finally, I really want to end here. For the students we've talked about today, because of the nature of their learning challenges, learning can be very self-defeating. For those of you who know or work with these students, you know how self-defeating and sometimes even punishing the experience of learning to read can be. It's all, right? My heart just breaks. Think about Daniel. The student conveying his experience with dysgraphia. So one of the things that is absolutely supported in the research, integrates behavior into our multi-tiered system of support model, is to really reinforce self-efficacy. That means getting your students to focus on that they can do it and finding ways to actually build in self-talk and opportunities to examine the success in their work. So here's some very simple examples. Begin every lesson with intention. So I can read and write sounds and words. What are we going to do today, everybody? We're going to read and write sounds and words. I want you to focus on something we're accomplishing, and every lesson we might be doing that. At the end of every lesson, we are in small tier 3 groups. I am what today? You were a hard worker. We get kids to identify a positive with their efforts and their hard work and celebrate that at the end of a lesson. Absolutely, doing some graphs. So this is a graph about words read. It doesn't have to even be fluency. It might be counting up the number of words read in a challenging decodable passage that kids are reading. And in this case, the lesson progresses. Kids read only 7 words in connected text at the beginning of the week, all the way through 35. And so the progression just increases across the week. But the idea is visual. It's visual. So we talked about students today who really can have profound learning challenges, and I want you to know their ways to support that. There are a couple great texts on this. I have thumbnails of those here. If you're interested more in this area, these are good suggestions to look into. Okay, so finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just summarize our big ideas. I know we're at a hard stop at 4 o'clock, so I will stop, but I am not running anywhere. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to stay on and either take those questions. So we can do that at the end. So today's big ideas, I moved from an understanding of that problem solving process through why language is so important when we think about students at tier 3. We used that knowledge to build a framework for instructional profiles, and then we got down to it. We looked under the hood and we matched instruction to student needs. I really want you to take this out the door today. I want you to understand that when we get to tier 3, we're asking how students process language. What are the instructional profiles related to that? What's the frame there? And 3, the instructional match. The visual here is, I hope you carry the stories of Aubrey and Daniel, Joseph and Gloria and Michael with you, using those as benchmarks, case studies for the areas we talked about, the instructional profiles we talked about today. And for me, when I think about multi-tiered systems of support in the triangle, I think about pulling that out. And this is who we're talking about. You're leaving with an intervention menu aligned with instructional profiles. And I'm hoping you'll take that intervention menu and use that to build the instructional matching we've discussed. Great resources are the National Center on Improving Literacy and also the National Center on Intensive Intervention for additional resources. So anyway, we're like right at time, and I'm so appreciative of your interest in tier 3 and of these students and of the good work that you will do to support them. So it's my pleasure. So Donna, I'll turn it back to you to conclude with odds and ends through Patton. And I'll stay here for questions.
You were absolutely wonderful, and thank you, everyone. I am going to share my screen real quick. I do want to take just a quick minute. We have a pretty big conference coming up November 10th and 11th that is free. It is virtual. We have many national presenters. We've partnered with the Positive Behavior Support and MTSS to offer 2 days of free resources. In addition, there is the Helix conference that is partnering with Penn State also for high expectations for students with low incidence. That's also happening in November.